You have now tapped in with the introspective father and son duo. Last name may be strange, but never strangers to the game. Adjust the listening devices and keep it loud.
Coming in, flex. I just wanna win, LABB, who we running with, 2233, I'm on 10 again, state your name.
Hello and welcome to another installment of No Strangers to the Game. Today's episode is entitled Why We Wear the Mask. Today we're going to be discussing code switching and, people of color in this country adapting to, the dominant culture in the workplace and in general public. How blacks or, other people of color feel the need to change the way they look, dress, or speak, when they're surrounded by a different, race. So for that, today I wanted to start off with asking you, I guess specifically in the workplace, but also in general, how have you felt either the need to code switch or just how do you view code switching and, adapting in that way in general?
Well, as W.E.B. Du Bois stated in the early 1900s, that to be black, living in America, you live in a state of double consciousness. That means you're adapting and trying to fit into the dominant culture. And at the same time, you're trying to be authentic to who you are and to your culture. And so that's something that has been prevalent in our community for years. And it's just one of those things that you grow up doing. And a lot of times you don't even realize it. For me, the first time I actually realized that I was doing that is when I, went to college and I got the chance to take Pan-African Studies classes. And it kind of laid out for me, the things that were happening, the discussions that we were having, and how I would adapt from, being a part of the dominant culture and how I talked, how I interacted with people, and then going back to my neighborhood, to the black culture and how we interact with one another. So it's something that has, I've been doing my whole life, but I've not, about 30 years ago, I realized what was actually happening and what we would call code switching.
Yeah, it's funny because I noticed it very early on, actually, in terms of code switching and just how, you had to adjust to fit into the dominant culture. I think I noticed it with you, actually. As you said, I was you always say I was an observant kid and I noticed a lot of things. I think it was always funny because when we had family over or your friends would have you, you dressed different, you talked a lot different versus when, let's say I wanted to go to a meeting with you and wanted to go to work with you, right? You dressed way different, talked a lot different. And I think it was tough to differentiate between, okay, he's just got to be more professional in this place as opposed to like, this is a totally different, way to even speak and act and feel. It had a totally different feel to it. And so I noticed that very early on, as well as with my grandma. In terms of code switching, she's from Texas, so she has a really, an accent. And so you always hear, when I was a kid, I heard her talk on the phone to her friends. She's talking real fast and going on and on and on. And then, she'd get like, hold on, I'm getting another call. And she'd get another call and and it just completely switched her voice and mannerism and demeanor with the way she spoke. So that's something I noticed early on. I just couldn't put a label on it. But talk about it specifically in jobs that you've worked on. Did you feel the need to, I guess, dress and act a certain way and did it feel like, okay, I'm doing this because this is just work culture or because you're trying to assimilate into another type of culture? What differentiate some of those, aspects?
Well, it was, most of it was professional in terms of how you dress. The jobs that I've had have required mostly to dress up with a shirt and tie, sometimes a suit. So the dress was one of those things that were required, but not just for me, but for everyone. As far as being able to talk the way that I talked, at home or in the workplace, it was different because the conversations were more professional and the topics and discussions were about work. And so things that I would talk about on my job, I wouldn't necessarily talk about at home. And so it allowed me or required me to adapt to that situation and use the appropriate terminology, the appropriate language, so that I could effectively communicate in the work environment. At home, obviously, it was a lot more loose. And, we talked about various things that didn't really lead to job terminology, and the workplace. And so those were the distinctions as far as, why I talked or dressed the way I did. Also, I dressed that way, and I did some experiments when I was in the workplace. I would see how when I was off work and people that I knew, and I dressed in maybe a hat and some t-shirts and jeans or sweats. And then when I put on a suit and a tie, people responded to me totally differently. And I always kind of played around with that and tried to use it to my advantage so that I'd be able to access the things that I needed, and people would respond to me the way I needed to respond to me in that professional environment. Not saying I necessarily liked it or agreed with it, but I understood that I needed to, function accordingly to get the responses that I was looking for.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, and as I've gone through and had, a few internships and some professional, I guess, experiences, I've felt the need to at least dress a certain way and act a certain way. Obviously, the conversations in the workplace are a lot different than the ones you would have at home. But what do you feel about just the way, I think anybody who's been around, Black culture a lot understands that we speak a lot differently when we're around our friends and other people who look and, act like us, as opposed to when we go to work. Whereas, when I hang around some of my white friends or what have you, their parents come home and they, seems like, and to me, they talk the same way they do at home, at least just from a, I don't know, phonics standpoint. Everything kind of sounds the same as when they go to work. Whereas with the Black folks, everything switches.
Well, I think a lot of that goes back to probably slavery.
Yeah.
There was times when, there would be conversations that would be happening, and you'd have both the slave master and then the enslaved that would be there, and the conversation would be going, and you would get two different interpretations of what was being said and what was being communicated. Yeah. For example, like you'd have the slave master, and they explain, say, for instance, the songs, like they'd be in the fields and they'd be singing. They talk about Steal Away Jesus and all these different spirituals. When the slave master and the untrained ear, it sounded like they were just singing spirituals. But to those that are out in the field, that often and sometimes meant that, hey, we was looking to get up out of here. So tonight at this time, this song means that we get up out of here. And so often you have that even with hip hop culture, where it's becoming more mainstream. It has become more mainstream, but the dialect, the terminology, the words and the conversation was totally different. And in fact, they created a hip hop dictionary, and we understood what was being said, and we didn't even have to be from, say, that part of the country to understand what was being said if we understood it in the context that it was being placed in. And so that's something I think that just over the years, for survival, we learned how to code switch, learn how to have these conversations to relay one thing to the dominant culture, and then at the same time, relay a whole ton of message to the culture and the people that we were around.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting dynamic when you bring up, I guess the transition from slaves, different speech and the things that they did for the reasons they did. And then to now what they kind of teach in school is that realistically what I'm talking about is Ebonics, right? It seems like a lot of times we're taught that Ebonics is the less educated, type of speech, and that it stems from the fact that, hey, slaves couldn't read and write, so they spoke this way, and that's why you get some of that carryover now. It seems like that's what I was taught in school. And it's sometimes, I guess it comes from a little bit of truth because slaves weren't allowed to read and write, and so maybe their speech changed in that way. But it also feels like it really downplays, at least my history, to where like, hey, your ancestors were just too dumb to talk. That's why you and your family communicate the way you do. And that seems to be kind of the message that's taken from it, and it just doesn't feel really fair.
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I think as I think back, I took a linguistics class in college. It was linguistics on African dialect. And what I learned in there is that the sentence structures and all those things and the patterns of speech in which we still to today, many of us carry out, came from, our deep rooted in African dialect in certain parts of the continent in which we came from, right? And that was carried over. Some of it has to do with just not being able to read, not understanding, some of those terms. And so a lot of times when you hear us talk, there's certain words in which we will not pronounce the TH at the end of a word. And so those are things that, from what I understand, were carried over from some of the African dialect. And some of it is just, part of putting words and sentences together, with what we had. So kind of like with people learning different languages, they kind of put together like they call Spanglish. So part of it is speaking English, part of it is Spanish. And so they're infusing those two dialects or languages, and it becomes something a little different. And you think about in Jamaica, when the dialect is largely the same, but the way that it's pronounced and way that it's stated, sometimes it's difficult if you're not trained and not accustomed to hearing it. You're not able to understand it. But they're still, for the most part, speaking, a similar dialect, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. I mean, you've got, in the Jamaican culture, real quick, you've got patois, which is basically its own dialect, but there's really words that you won't understand if you've never heard it or you're not around it very much. And then you have just a Jamaican accent where they're speaking English. It just sounds a lot different because, the way they speak. But it's in pop culture, I guess, in things like today, there's a big push to make Ebonics an official language. I wanted to ask you, do you feel that that's something that is necessary? Because I don't believe that Spanglish is an official language. Do you feel it's necessary to make Ebonics an official language, or is that, what are your thoughts on it in general?
I don't think it's necessary to make it official language personally. I think it's good to be able to recognize the differences in how we speak and why, to at least acknowledge it. Because like you stated earlier, that you felt it's unfair to, label how, our culture speaks at times and often as a uneducated form of speaking.
Yeah.
And so I think it's good to acknowledge that, hey, these are the dialects and these are the things that came out of various situations that are here now. But for me anyway, I don't know if I think it's necessary to call it a separate language.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I personally don't think that really does much. I just think that, like I said, I think the way it's taught has to be changed, because it's unfair for, a young Black student to be sitting in class and be told that, hey, your ancestors and the way they spoke really it just seems like it purely stems from them being uneducated, not being able to read and write. And so now you go home and that's kind of the dialect being spoken in your household, or at least some traces of it are in the dialects being spoken in your household. And what are you supposed to believe about that? And the bias that creates within you, but not only then you have other kids, of other races in your class, and as they grow up, they believe the same thing. Hey, that speech that that speech that you have, or that speech that your family has, that comes from this. And so realistically, that creates bias as they grow up, they become employers. And as you're interviewing an employee, you're looking at them differently because of what you were taught at such a young age. And so that's the thing that has to change, and not necessarily becoming an official language. But yeah.
Well, to kind of end, as far as that goes, the English language itself is a collection of various dialects and languages. So that's one of the things, that just a combination of different languages and dialects. So, that's my thoughts on that.
I want to switch gears to, we've been talking about Ebonics. I want to talk more so about, the look, because there definitely is, I guess, in our country, a bias towards, I would say, a cultured look, or in our case, a Black look. So I went to high school at a Jesuit Catholic high school, where they had a strict dress code and, wanted, things to be, I guess, clean cut. And so they had, for guys anyway, the hair requirements were, hey, hair can't go over the ears and it has to be a natural look. That's direct quote. Cannot go hang over the ears, and has to be a natural look. So I guess, I don't know if it was defiance or I don't know, but I decided, okay, I'm going to grow my hair out, because as long as my hair grows, as long as I can get it to grow, it doesn't go over my ears. That's not how our hair grows, right? It's obviously a much different look than, I guess you could say, who that rule was written for. And so I grew my hair out super long. It kind of got into a fro. I kind of curled it and twisted it to be all kind of, I guess, wild looking, or at least natural looking for our culture. And I was in compliance with the rule. I want to get your opinion on, I guess, my motives, and also your general thoughts on me growing my hair out, and I guess getting around that rule.
Well, first, I mean, I would say I like the hairstyle. I thought it was a nice look. It was a wild look, but it was still a neat, it was something that looked like, hey, I didn't try, but, it's still a neat look. I think your whole thing was partly just lazy. The other part was just being defiant, because you said, probably looked at it and say, well, let me see how I can take this rule and use it. Stay within the guidelines, within the box, but stretch it out a little.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, you just have this way of defying things in a manner that's not disrespectful, that's not, in your face or rude. It's just, I'm gonna defy it because I want to or because I can, and I'm gonna do it in a way that there's really nothing you can say about it.
Yeah.
There's been many times I noticed that as a kid, where you would just do things and it was like, it would piss me off. I would be agitated, but I couldn't find a real rationale for punishing you for that action, because you knew just where to draw that line to where I can do enough to be defiant without getting myself in trouble. So I thought it was funny when you did that, as far as your hair and growing it out at the school. And one particular instance, go ahead.
And I think it's one point that I wanted to get to is, I know for me, going to high school, that was my first time being around, I guess, white kids in that amount for that long. And so what I saw was, growing up as a black kid, you get your hair cut at least once a month, if not, more often than that. You get in lineups, you're trying to get it faded so it looks, I guess, neater or what have you. And I saw them, and these kids don't get haircuts for, 1-2 months at a time. Their hair's just growing. They don't have lineups. They're not getting, they may get a haircut every once in a while just to make sure it doesn't get too long. But other than that, it's not a big deal. They wake up in the morning, they flip it over on one side, and they walk out the door. And so I started to think, why is my culture, if we feel like we need to get up, at least every 2 weeks or so, first of all, every morning we're brushing it, trying to get waves or make sure it doesn't look our natural state. We're fading it. We're doing all these things to try to make it look, I guess, more clean. And it's not necessarily our natural look. I'm like, why are we doing these things? So I was just, I guess, kind of a social experiment to see, first of all, what would my hair look like when I did that? But two, just if I took the same action steps they did every morning with their hair and I did it with mine, how would the results be, I guess, perceived by, first of all, my culture, because I got a lot of comments about it and things from even just my people, but also, with, my school and how the rules there were set up, how would it be perceived in that way? So I think that was another big thing for me, was just kind of to I guess, see things from that view. But you're right. I also was pretty lazy and didn't like combing my hair and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, and I think it probably that part of that defiance has always been a part of our culture, because we've always since, over the last 400 years, fighting for that identity, fighting for independence in ways that we could. And I think that just carried on naturally throughout history for us. And I think one of the prevalent examples of that is hip hop. Music has always been that for our culture, where it was speaking in double tongues. It was saying one thing, but it meant something totally different depending on who the listener was. And so when hip hop came along, I think it really boldly stated defiance. I mean, here you create a culture, you create a whole art form of music with no instruments. You know what I mean? Yeah. The graffiti, the dress, and how we acted and how we moved was something that was of defiance, stating that we're here, I'm bold, and deal with it. Yeah. And so I think that's something that has carried on and is carried on today, particularly with your generation and even my generation, because I was born and was around when the first recorded rap song came out in 1978, 79, Rapper's Delight. I mean, there was songs before that, but that was the first one that was actually recorded and promoted to be sold. So Yeah. So defiance is part of the culture to really create that space and to say, hey, I'm independent and this is who I am. Notice me.
I look at it and say that it didn't, I think that it's tough because obviously when hip hop came out, it was showing black culture in a light that I don't think white folks ever saw, because every time we went around them, we code switched. We changed who we were and we started to act a lot different. But what I do think it did too was, in that time, at least I wasn't alive, so I can't speak to what I saw. But looking back through, history and just kind of what you see from that time, it looks like it created almost some division. And what I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that there were people who viewed it and said, hey, man, this is dope. Like, I love black culture, and people who wanted to emulate it. And then I think there was obviously a different demographic that said, that's not right. You know what I mean? That's not civilized or whatever it is. What I think helped bridge the gap and bring the two worlds together was when you started to see, I guess, rap artists or athletes or all of these people, who were embracing black culture make real money and start to become a part of corporate America. J. Cole talks about it briefly. He says, he went into interviews with a bunch of record labels, and he knew his interview was probably going to be with some, big wig and some white guys, right? So he did things. He cut his hair. He wanted to make sure himself looked clean a little bit. And this is a rapper, so imagine, a different job. But he says that when he went into his interview with Jay-Z, because Jay-Z was the executive at Rockefeller Records, and he said, Jay-Z will understand. You know what I mean? He'll get it. You know what I mean? This is me coming to the table with another black man. I don't need to do my hair. I don't need to dress up, at least to that degree, because he'll understand it. So I think when you see rappers or athletes or just blacks in general, at least to ascend to a level of, I guess, some type of power, you look at it and you say, if I'm sitting across the table from somebody who will understand me, I don't need to go out of my way to change, the way I act, look, or dress, or do anything like that out of the ordinary to make them feel, I guess, comfortable. Because that's what it comes down to, is we code switch and we do these things because, like I said, I think there's still that divide of people who look at real black culture and say that's somewhat uncivilized in a way. And maybe it's subconscious, but I think there is that thought, at least for some.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that in terms of looking at the example you gave with J. Cole meeting with Jay-Z versus meeting with, corporate directors and heads of major corporations that were white or non-black. And so that's the code switching. That's the part where you go in and you figure out where an environment am I going in and how do I need to prepare myself to go into that environment. And so it's just part of the instincts. It's part of survival. And we have to do that in everything we do. You don't go to the swimming pool or to the beach with a 3-piece suit on. Each environment, each situation sometimes call for a different response or a different approach. And so let's make sure we don't get mixed up with, code switching from a cultural standpoint, then, adapting to situations because it fits the environment that we're going into, because that's the smart thing to do. So I get that point, and I think something that we do often, and it's just something that's going to be around. I do see that there's more people in general across the globe who have taken on the hip hop culture, the rap culture, in which the way they dress, the way they talk, the way they walk. And I see, and I often sometimes when I'm looking and scrolling through social media, where you have different groups that are not black using the N-word, and talking to each other. And so we have, and that culture has permeated the world and mainstream culture to the point to where sometimes it's hard to distinguish between who's who. If you turn the lights out and just start listening to people talk, you probably wouldn't know who that was. You couldn't distinguish if this is a white person, black person, Asian, Latinx, or whomever. Yeah. So it's definitely permeated the mainstream.
It goes back to what I was saying, is there was like a divide. You had, I think, a large, when hip hop became global and you started to see black culture in mainstream media, I think you had those, like I said, that looked at it and said, man, that's uncivilized. It's unsettling really for them. And then those who said, man, this is dope. I really want to emulate it. And so we've gotten those two different responses for people in mainstream media today. You have so many people that want to look, act, dress, talk, all of these things as blacks do. And then those who really kind of despise it. So I think it's created that divide, and that's what you're talking about, where you see a lot of people really trying to emulate it.
Yeah, and I even seen that in the gang culture. I remember coming up where you could distinctly identify who was a gang member just by how they dressed. And now you can go out and you see people and you don't know is this dude in the gang or not, because most young people of a certain age dress very much alike. There's not too many distinctions. I remember coming up, you had the preppy, then you had the gangsters, then you just had people who just wore what they had. You know what I mean? So there was a big distinction on how people dress. Now, I don't see that distinction as much when you go out and just in everyday life, regardless of, the people's background and culture.
I remember that because when we used to go to LA all the time. We have family in LA. We used to live in LA. So we spent a lot of time in LA. And every time we went, I had, blue shoes, red shoes, stuff like that. And you would always be like, don't wear that blue t-shirt or don't wear that red t-shirt. And I was like, as I got older, I knew where it came from, right? A lot of gang culture in LA that I didn't necessarily get growing up and where I did. But I also understood to a degree that, the things had changed, you know what I mean, from when you were, I guess, living out there in LA. I knew that things were kind of different, where you could wear blue and you weren't automatically a Crip, you know what I mean? Or things like that. There were certain type of ties you had to make, or certain type of, articles you had to wear to really make that association. And could there be that mistake? Yes. But I definitely think it was a little different from when you were coming up. And so that was something that I remember we used to go back and forth on. I kind of wanted to get back to hairstyles, because you said that, you don't want to get it confused. There obviously is a difference between, the way you dress when you're comfortable at home with your family, around friends, and the way you, for all cultures, the way you dress when you need to go and be professional. And I completely understand that. I think the biggest distinction for me in terms of code switching that I see is it affects Black men. And I think I've obviously been through it, as we talked about my experience, but mainly Black women and their hair. I want to get back to the hair, because when we talk about those natural looks or cleaning it up, I think I have two sisters, and I remember my older sister every morning getting up and flat ironing her hair to make it look straight. And I always wondered where that came from. And as I got older, I realized, that was probably what was more socially acceptable, opposed to putting, I love when Malia, my little sister, who's really younger, she puts her hair in a big puff or two, big puff balls, and just kind of lets it be natural, her natural hair, but she hates it. And so obviously we never taught her that at home. We always tell her we love the way that looks. Where is she getting that from? And so that's an interesting point for me in terms of the hair for Black women, especially. So dive into that.
And speaking on your sister, it's what she sees, and a lot of times it's subtle. So with media and what you see on the TV, most of the women on TV that she watches, the girls, the women, their hair is typically straight. There's starting to be more images that show women of color or Black women with their hair in its natural state. But oftentimes that's not the case. Also, she's growing up in an area where she's one of very few Black children where she lives, the school she goes to. So I think she may be looking around her and saying that, my hair is much different than everybody else's. And she hasn't really truly learned to appreciate that. She may get instances where people want to touch it, and people may look at it and, may respond differently. So I think there may be various reasons as to why, but the main point is that I don't believe she sees enough people with their hair like that to where she can say, I like that and I appreciate it.
Yeah. With that, they've kind of created this new piece of legislation called the Crown Act, which basically states that any type of hair color or any type of hairstyle, or especially, as it pertains to race and a certain type of race's hair, natural hairstyle and the hairstyles that they predominantly wear, has to be accepted in the workplace and can't be discriminated against. Because we've seen in the past where people wouldn't get jobs, or they would be told to change their hair because it didn't look a certain way. And so that, I think, I want to get your input on that piece of legislation. I think for me, really quickly, it has good and bad. I think it's annoying that something has to be signed into legislation for us to not be discriminated against. That it feels kind of annoying, but at least I think what the law does do is allow you to where when it does happen, you can take some legal action. And we both know that that's where the change is really going to come from, where people start to be like, okay, this is going to hurt me if I react this way, if I treat people this way because of this, because they can take legal action now. So what are your thoughts on that as a whole? Is it something that's necessary? Do you view as good, or just kind of?
I see it as, first of all, it lets us know that we're still not considered citizens of this country.
Yeah.
If we had to enact laws for us to just function in our natural way, that means that, to me, we're still not accepted and viewed as, citizens of the United States of America. We see that also in with the voting rights, right?
Yeah.
Every 25 years, we have to vote to make sure that we are allowed to vote, in elections. So there's something deeply rooted in the Constitution. I know it says one thing, but how it's carried out and enforced says something totally different. There shouldn't have to be amendments because it says all men are created equal. That's it.
Yeah.
So we shouldn't have to say, well, we got to add a 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. It's just like all men, we're men. And so until we change that whole perspective as to we're even considered citizens of this country, we're going to continue to enact these laws. I'm glad that the law has been put in place, and it's not in every state, if I'm not mistaken.
No, it's not.
So you still have states that, that doesn't even count.
Yeah.
But like you said, also, it's a part that feels like, I agree. I'm happy that you're making this effort, but I'm, just appalled that we even have to do this. It's just disgusting and disheartening that I have to vote. Somebody has to vote for me to wear my hair in its natural state. So, so that's my response on that.
I want to end with 2 questions for you because they really pertain to you. I have no experience with them. The first one is, now that you're kind of higher up, within your company and a part of corporate America, do you still feel any pressure or any bias, against, I guess, Black culture within your company specifically, or in the corporate world in general? We don't want to get nobody in trouble in here. But 2, I'll get into the second one after, actually. Answer that one first.
Yeah. To answer your question, the organization I work for here in the desert, and I'm not going to name it, but it's probably one that has probably more African Americans and Black people in higher level positions than places that I've worked throughout the Valley over the last 16, 17 years that I've been here.
Yeah.
However, there's still a lot to be learned as far as culturally. And in the position that I am, that I get a chance to hire people, I'm a director, and I'm allowed to, bring in people that I think are going to benefit the organization. I feel a sense of pressure to bring on the right people, particularly if they're Black. And I don't necessarily go out just looking for Black people to hire, but if they are hired and they are candidates, I feel that if I do hire them, that they have to come to the table and they have to be on point. Yeah. And the reason I say that is because there's so few of us out here, and in the jobs that I've had, there's been so few in those positions and places that I feel that we have to make sure that we leave the doors open behind us, so that that experience is a good experience for these organizations, so that they would be willing to hire more Blacks in some of these positions. That's one of the things I feel that's important, that I have to represent us well. And it's sad on an occasion that I feel I have to represent a community or a culture, but that's where we're at. So I take on that, and I take it very serious that I represent well, and the people that I bring in represent as well also.
And it goes back to what you always taught me growing up was, hey, the unfortunate reality of the world we live in is that because of the color of your skin, you're going to have to be twice as good as the person next to you who doesn't have the same color skin. And it's unfortunate, but hey, that's the world we live in. So do what you got to do. Yeah.
And that's why we really need to begin to develop and create businesses in which we control. Yeah. And that way we hire and we can set the tone on what we want our businesses and companies to look like, to run like. And so that's an area that we have to really improve in as well.
So piggybacking off of what I was just saying with, the way you taught me and my sisters growing up, speak just real quick about raising, you've raised a young black female and a young black male. In today's world, you're raising another young black female at the time. So talk about the delicate balance between telling your child, hey, the world may not accept some of the things in the way you are because of the color of your skin. That's an unfortunate reality. Talk about the delicate balance of like, hey, stay who you are. Be proud of your culture. Be proud to be black. Be proud to, wear your hair in your natural state. All of these things, but also like we talked about, being able to at least function and be able to, I guess, be a part of our society and gain some level of success. How do you teach that balance?
Well, I always taught you guys to be authentic to who you are. Knowing my grandmother, your great grandmother, Mama, knowing my mom, your grandmother, Joyce, or Nan, as you call her, knowing Granny Josie, and the people that I grew up around. When you saw these people, when you see them, you get exactly what they are. There's no real false pretenses or someone being something different than who they are. For the most part, what you see is what you get. And so I grew up in that environment where I always was comfortable being who I am. I also knew that I had to go in certain situations and adapt to that environment, and at the same time be comfortable being myself without feeling like I'm, compromising myself or my integrity. And so I always wanted you to be comfortable in your skin as well as your sisters, to be able to accept you, however big, tall, however short, however fat, skinny, whatever it is, this is who I am, this is me, and love that. And what I found in doing that, when you love yourself and you look at yourself and you're proud of who you are and where you are, I see that people gravitate to you and they accept you and they love you. I give a quick example of, me, I have skinny legs, and growing up is out here in the desert, it was always hot. So I was accustomed to wearing shorts, and, what people said or thought meant nothing to me. I can tell you, a friend of mine, my roommate, when I got to Northridge, he said, man, you inspired me to wear shorts. I'm like, well, he said, man, I looked at your legs and I said, if he can wear shorts, I can wear shorts. And I was like, look, man, it's just too hot to be out here trying to figure out what people think. This is what it is. This is how I'm rolling. So I've always been fairly comfortable with who I am and, functioning in that realm.
Yeah, well, I think that's something you definitely passed down to us, and we got it from all of our family members. But I think you did a good job of, giving us that balance and allowing us to be who we are, but also teaching us to function in the society we live in. So I guess thank you for that.
Well, thank you for listening and and carrying it out. And one other thing I want to say to you, as you begin to approach your career and aspire to do great things, always set your price. Meaning, what is it that I'm going to do, and what is it that we not even compromising? There's always got to be that price, because the higher you go, in many instances, you may be approached to compromise your integrity and who you are. And you never want to do that. When you lay down at night, you want to be able to lay down and feel that and know that I made the best decisions without compromising who I am, and I can live with that. And so that's one thing I want you guys, you in particular, as well as your sisters, to know that you don't do anything for money to the point of where you compromise who you are, the fame and all that. That stuff will come if you do the right thing. If you look at Dave Chappelle, and the decision he made to say, you know what, the price got too high for me and I'm not willing to pay that. He took a hit, but when you look at him, he came back around, and, he's doing just as well, if not better now than when he decided to leave. So I just want you to always keep that in mind, that I have a price and I have a certain boundary that I won't pass, because I had to live with myself and the people coming after me and the integrity that I have to demonstrate and live by, is too important.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Well, with that being said, I think that's going to wrap up another episode of No Strangers to the Game. We appreciate all our listeners for tuning in, and make sure you tune in next time.
All right, peace.
All right, that'll wrap up today's episode. Glad we could take a moment to put you up on game. We post a new podcast every Sunday morning. Now you know. Peace.